Salam, everyone. Welcome. My name is Omar Aziz. I am the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center at the University of California, Riverside. We're very excited to have you all join us today for the first day of our Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later. As many of you may be aware, this week marks the 20th anniversary of when the first rockets were launched into Afghanistan. And we wanted to take some time this week to reflect on the last 20 years and beyond, to talk about what has happened, what has occurred, and what we can expect moving forward. So we're very grateful for the students, the staff, the faculty who have helped us put this event on. And also wanted to shout out the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of California, Riverside for their support. A little bit about the Middle Eastern Student Center at UC Riverside. We are one of 10 ethnic and gender resource centers on our campus where we support our Southwest Asian, North African, or SWANA students or Middle Eastern students on campus, working towards building support, education, and a sense of community for them. So we wanted to take this opportunity to welcome you all for joining us today. And I would be remiss to not include just also mentioning that my thoughts and for many of us we are deeply affected by the events that have been unfolding most recently in Afghanistan, and so we want to our thoughts and prayers and hearts are with those people right now, with the people of Afghanistan who have been suffering for more than 20 years now of war and we want to make sure that their thoughts are centered throughout this week, throughout our panels and throughout our discussions. And we know that for many of us, we are dealing with family members or loved ones and friends, colleagues who are trying to get out of the country or are resettling or are learning to live within this new environment. And so our hearts are with them at this moment in time, and we hope to center and keep those in mind as we go along through this week's events. So I want to encourage you all throughout this week, as you're hearing our speakers present, to use these hashtags. Hashtags written behind me, hashtag UCR AFG or AFG Symposium, to share any tweets, any comments, any questions you might have. We have the YouTube stream going up there, so please make sure you're asking questions. We'll make sure we have time to do that towards the end of today's discussion. So please use the hashtag throughout this week as we're going through our different panelists and speakers. Please make sure you're sharing this, sharing the links and the YouTube videos for folks to get a chance to watch who maybe weren't able to join us live. So I'll go ahead and get us started by introducing today's keynote speaker, our first keynote speaker of the week, Professor Dr. Ali A. Olomi, who is Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic History at Penn State Abington and an affiliated scholar with the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. He researches medieval Islamic thought and modern Muslim political movements. His scholarship examines the way Muslims imagine the world and around them through the intersection of religion and science and empire and identity. He has lectured nationally and internationally on Muslim politics, U.S. involvement in the Middle East and Afghanistan, and Islamic history. So I wanted to make sure to, welcome Dr. Olomi here today. We're very excited to have him here. Please follow him on Twitter. He's got some great, really great, interesting things for you all to check out if you haven't had a chance yet. But I'm proud to call him a friend, along with being a colleague and scholar, and an important voice in the Afghan community. So thank you, Dr. Olomi, for joining us. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you at this time.
Thank you, Omar, for that very kind and generous introduction. I'm very proud to call you a friend and a colleague, and I'm very excited to join you all to talk a little bit about the history of Afghanistan. But first, just a quick thank you both to Omar, to Ali Sadat, who's running behind the scenes, running all the tech stuff. As anyone is familiar, academics are notoriously bad at any form of tech. For the past year, we've all been doing Zoom University and failing miserably at all of the tech. So thank you, Ali, for all your help, Ali Sadat, and of course to the Middle Eastern Student Center for inviting me to have this very important conversation. And for all of you who are tuning in to listen to a history talk at 3 p.m. or 12 p.m., wherever you are on a Monday afternoon, you are all brave souls for wanting to hear a little bit about history. What I hope to do today is talk about the history of Afghanistan and place it within a historical context, the contemporary moment, place it within a context, and maybe provide a little bit of nuance. The ulterior motive here is to convince you all of the importance of history. A little bit of a not so secret mission of mine here is to demonstrate the importance of history as a lens of analysis, particularly as we will see the tension between history and public memory, which is going to be very important for our understanding of Afghanistan. So with that, I want to start with a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation. We're going to talk about the history. Let me see if I can bring this up. There we go. Can everyone see it? Can we get a kind of confirmation from Omar or Ali if you all can see the PowerPoint? I'm going to assume yes. Okay, so we'll get started. I want to start really with the idea of remembering of Afghanistan. Something that quite strikes me is that I've been teaching the history of the Middle East, the history of Islam for a little bit now, and I always ask my students the same question. I ask them, what is the longest foreign war that the United States has engaged in? And almost none of them ever remember Afghanistan. Now, that's not their fault. They were babies when the war started, but it shaped their entire lives. When the war started, I was in middle school, I think. I was very young, and now I'm a college professor teaching this history. So it is one of the longest wars, but it's also a war that we choose to forget. It was quite striking for me when I was in school and Afghanistan suddenly became on everyone's lips. Before that, in the 90s, if someone asked, where are you from? And you said Afghanistan, they gave you blank looks. But shortly thereafterwards, everybody knew what Afghanistan was, where Afghanistan was, who Afghans were. It was very much part of the public consciousness, but only for a brief moment. Shortly thereafterwards, people seem to have forgotten. Now, we historians don't have that particular luxury. It is our burden, our duty to remember. So it always struck me as fascinating that by the 2007 or so, you would mention Afghanistan, oh yeah, we were at war in Afghanistan. It sort of faded into the background. And so hopefully today, a little bit of talk around history can really drive home the importance of remembering. So I want to start with the Buddhas of Bamyan. I think this is a really good demonstration of memory. The Buddhas of Bamyan were these historical heritage sites in Afghanistan, and they were destroyed by the Taliban. It was a moment of sort of international outcry when the Taliban destroyed them. I remember the coverage, why the Taliban are destroying the Buddhas. And we're told that in Afghanistan recently, Supreme Leader Mullah Muhammad Omar issued an edict against un-Islamic graven images. The idea here being that Afghanistan was a site of sort of backwards Islam, that there was this retrograde idea about historical sites and heritage sites, and therefore these places were at risk. This was the coverage. Here it is at USA Today. The only problem was that this isn't actually the Taliban's stated reason for destroying the Buddhas of Bamyan. They're actually quite explicit. Here we have them telling us why they destroyed it. In the late 90s, the UN offered a large sum of money in order to preserve these statues. At the same time, the Taliban were seeking some type of international aid in order to alleviate the economic strain on ordinary Afghans. It was endemic poverty, food shortages, resource shortages, even lack of clean waters. We see here, the scholars told them that instead of spending money on statues, why didn't they help our children who are dying of malnutrition? They rejected that, saying that this money is only for the statues. In other words, the public memory around the Buddhas of Bamyan differs from what actually happens. It differs from the history of that time period. And I think it stands as a particularly important metaphor going forward. How do we remember Afghanistan? What role does memory play? Does nuance in any way, shape, or form get introduced? Or do we fall into these sort of reductive narratives in which we see Afghanistan as a backwards place, a place doomed to be ungovernable, a place that is doomed to be governed by retrograde Islamist thinkers? When in actuality, the history of Afghanistan is far more complicated. Very rarely do we talk about the pre-modern history of Afghanistan as how it was a site of multiple empires, not a graveyard of empires, but a crossroads of empires, in which Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Hinduism, and Islam often lived side by side with one another. Here I'm thinking of the work of Arzu Azad on medieval Balkh, where she talks about how the sacred sites of the Muslims were often side by side with the sacred sites of the Buddhists. We see, of course, that for centuries, Islam has been in Afghanistan for about 1,000+ years. And in those 1,000+ years, the Buddhas of Bamyan were preserved. So too were the stupas of Afghanistan and various sacred sites. There are certainly exceptions, various empires or dynasties that had more of a restricted understanding of these sites. But on the whole, the history of Afghanistan is one of coexistence. It's one of religions living side by side with one another. Now, that's not to paint a rosy picture, but it's also to recognize that there is a more complicated history here. That alongside the violent history of the nation state, which includes the repression of Hazara people, which includes imperial and colonial interests, there is a much older pre-modern history in which people lived side by side, in which people coexisted with one another. I am reminded here of the quote from James Baldwin, which I think is a really important quote, and hopefully I can encourage you all to keep this in the back of your mind as we go forward with this talk. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. In other words, history is the very thing that shapes us, even if we are unconscious of it, even if we are unaware of it. And I think this is important to remember, to keep this quote in mind as we talk about the complicated and messy history of Afghanistan. To understand the contemporary moment, to understand what is going on right now, to really comprehend how Afghanistan is once more in the hands of the Taliban, we must first look at its much older history caught between the great powers. We must turn to the Soviet invasion of 1979. Now, we're told that this is the turning point in Afghanistan's history. The Soviet Union invaded in Afghanistan, therefore becomes a failed state, or a state that is captured and ensnared by a long-term insurgency. But the actuality is that the history starts much earlier than that. To understand the history of the invasion, you have to actually go back decades earlier to the US and Soviet involvement in the 50s and 60s. And this comes down to two major projects. First is an infrastructure building project. For the United States was involved in Afghanistan going all the way back to the 1950s, not in 2001, but all the way back to the 1950s. It poured millions of dollars into the Helmand Valley project, while the Soviet Union poured its money into the Salang Pass. These two infrastructure projects produced a modernizing movement within Afghanistan that was almost entirely reliant on foreign aid. That's important to understand. Here you have a young, nascent nation state whose entire economy rests on foreign aid. Foreign aid to pay its workers, foreign aid to pay its infrastructure projects, and foreign aid to prop its government. This structure will continue to haunt the history of Afghanistan up until 2021. Indeed, all of history can be understood as a series of hauntings that shape the present moment. To really understand these infrastructure projects, I really encourage people to check out Timothy Noonan's work on in the infrastructure building and the foreign aid that was available and the modernizing projects from the Soviet Union side. In addition to the infrastructure building, Kabul University would become the ideological backdrop of the battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would prop up and support young Marxist thinkers, journalists, and engineers who would grow up in the experience of an economy that failed to support ordinary Afghans, an economy that was entirely reliant on foreign aid. The United States, on the other hand, would ally itself with the Islamist factions within Kabul University, with one of the most retrograde thinkers, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a terribly horrific individual who ends up being exiled from Kabul University in Afghanistan as a result of him murdering a young Marxist activist. He also carries out a series of horrific acid attacks, him and his followers, against Afghan women who were participating in Kabul University at the time. So you have these two factions that emerge, the Marxist bloc and this Islamist faction, both of which are being propped up either by the Soviet Union or by the United States. But it's out of this moment, this support from these foreign powers, these great international powers, that will set the stage for the revolution that will shape Afghanistan's history. A new order will emerge. Young thinkers, young activists, journalists, scholars, young military commanders who graduate from Kabul University but enter into a workforce in an economy that simply cannot support them. An economy that is entirely reliant on US aid or on Soviet Union aid. Daoud Khan, who was the leader of Afghanistan at the time, quite famously said that he enjoyed nothing more than lighting his American cigarette with a Soviet or a Russian match, indicating that the government of Afghanistan was deeply indebted to foreign aid. But what this meant was that the economy failed to support this new order of young activists and thinkers. The result was endemic corruption. In order to survive, almost everybody had to skim a little bit off of the top. That doesn't mean that Afghanistan is inherently corrupt or that everyone is inclined towards corruption, but rather the international order of global capitalism, the availability of foreign aid, and the dependence of Afghanistan's economy on that foreign aid is what produces the conditions for that corruption. Remember this, as this too will be a haunting that will shape the present and contemporary moment. Foreign aid that floods into Afghanistan and sets the economic structure for corruption. The result will be a revolution. Those very same young thinkers and activists will participate in a revolution to overthrow the government that fails to meet the needs of ordinary Afghans. They hope to create a new order, an order in which they can produce an economy that supports ordinary Afghans. They overthrow the leader of Afghanistan, Dawood Khan, killing his family, and establish the People's Republic of Afghanistan, the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan, a Marxist-aligned government. Now, this Marxist-aligned government initially made some great strides in society. One of the things that we see is women's rights really being expanded, the rights to education. They also did begin to produce an economy that started to support people. People were accorded for the fact that people had access to basic goods that were readily available: food, flour, access to resources. This was all part of the radical overturn of the Marxist government, the reformation that they introduced. Yet at the same time, they were wildly repressive. We have evidence from the Soviet Union reaching out to the leader of the Marxist government in Afghanistan, Mohammad Taraki, asking him to tone it down because the violent reprisals were going to produce a backlash. This violent suppression, along with international meddling, will produce an insurgency, a real, true insurgency. We are told by historians like Thomas Barfield that foreign aid would be readily available because by breaking the Cold War status, the Soviet Union had provoked the United States by moving beyond its post-war boundaries, and Saudi Arabia by invading a Muslim country. We're told that the Marxist government will reach out to the Soviet Union. Here we have an image of Mohammad Taraki meeting with his counterpart, the Soviet Union, asking for some type of international aid. And yet the history is actually more complicated than that. The Soviet Union didn't invade and then the United States got involved. Quite the opposite. The United States was involved from the very get-go, part of an attempt to foment some form of anti-Soviet resistance. We have here the words of Brzezinski, the national security advisor of Jimmy Carter. According to the official version of history, the CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during the 1980s, that is to say, after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979. But the reality, secretly guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was in July 3rd of 1979 that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. In other words, U.S. aid it was introduced far earlier than the actual Soviet invasion. Now, we should be careful here. This seems to be Brzezinski projecting an element of confidence backwards. This is Brzezinski bragging a little bit. And I think the historian Connor Tobin does a fantastic job of really looking at the work of Brzezinski and looking at the U.S. policy. U.S. policy towards Afghanistan at this time period is muddled. It's unclear. There are different factions. People like Brzezinski seem to have been very interested in getting involved early on and sending aid to the Mujahideen early in this case, while in other instances, other factions of the national security apparatus of the United States was far more hesitant. So there is a bit of bragging going on here. But regardless, I think this really speaks to the dismissive attitude of the United States towards the crisis in Afghanistan. Brzezinski goes on to say, what is more important to the history of the world, the Taliban or the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Some stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War. When he means some stirred up Muslims, it's important to put this into context. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the US's imperial meddling in the country results in the displacements of somewhere up to 5 to 10 million Afghans and anywhere between 2 to 5 million Afghan deaths. And that's not even counting the number of people that are maimed or injured as a result of the war. So when he says stirred up Muslims, it's It's important to remember that particular context. So while Brzezinski may be projecting some element of confidence and bragging a little bit about the US's capabilities here, when in actuality their response was a bit muddled early on, it does highlight the imperial interest of the United States in Afghanistan and the real dismissal of the crisis here. What we see is that the United States begins to offer training and allying themselves with the most regressive elements of the Mujahideen. Now, it is important to understand that the Mujahideen are not the Taliban. They are not synonymous with one another. This flattens a far more complicated history. The Soviet archives themselves openly admit that the Mujahideen are a popular uprising, a movement by ordinary Afghans resisting an unpopular government in Kabul while rejecting some form of imperial meddling. But that there are different factions. The most regressive of these factions, the Islamist factions led by people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, will be the group that the United States allies itself with. From the Directorate of Intelligence, we know that training courses are offered to Afghan resistance fighters. Here we have from the document, most basic training courses last about 10 days, including instruction in the use of small arms and light machine guns, RPG-7s and mines. Groups that are especially active also receive training on heavier weapons such as mortars, recoilless rifles, and heavy machine guns. So the United States is arming, supporting, and funding the most regressive elements of the anti-Soviet movement, working with its ally, Pakistan's intelligence services, ISI, working with China, who is working with the Maoist resistance fighters amongst the Mujahideen, and with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Ordinary Afghans aren't getting training from the United States, so it's important to recognize this, that the majority of the Mujahideen are just ordinary Afghans rising up. But the most organized of these elements, the most retrograde and regressive and reactionary of these elements, will end up becoming the allies of the United States. And that history will haunt the beginnings of the Taliban and shape what will come afterwards. There's actually a really interesting bit here in this same document that complains. The CIA complains about Afghans having their own sense of time. Most Afghans have a fundamentally different concept of time than Westerners. According to experts on Afghanistan, Afghans are indifferent to time. Hurrying is foreign to them, and their timing of their activities is unpredictable and rarely planned. So this complaint is actually quite familiar to anyone who's grown up in Middle Eastern culture, South Asian culture, any type of Muslim world. They recognize, or the global South more broadly, who everyone operates knows that these people operate off of a non-capitalist sense of time, or as we jokingly refer to it as inshallah time. You say inshallah, and then it'll happen sometime in the future. But here you have the CIA complaining that these elements, these resistance fighters, when it came time to tea, would throw down their guns and go and have tea. They also complained further that they were not willing to kill themselves as part of their resistance movement. In other words, we don't see any cases of suicide bombing during this time period. That instead, they're far more inclined to meet with their opponents, that they are willing to work with tribal elders and village elders in order to find some negotiated solution. So these complaints are part of the language, the colonial and imperial language about Afghans. In addition to offering formal training, there was also an attempt to really foment a foreign movement. And that foreign movement came in the form of Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was a sort of ally of the United States. Here we have, in the early 90s, the description of Osama bin Laden, anti-Soviet warrior, puts his army on the road to peace. Now, that's not the way we would describe him in the 2000s, is it? I always show this to my students, and they're kind of shocked that that's the way that the Western world imagined Osama bin Laden. Because early on, he served American interests to some degree. Now, it's unclear whether he received training or whether he received funding, but he was part of the larger strategy of introducing foreign fighters to support the Mujahideen, to bring in foreign fighters as an anti-Soviet tactic. In addition to introducing these foreign fighters, the United States does something else. It starts to create these textbooks in order to teach young Afghan children jihad. These textbooks, which the United States will spend millions of dollars with the University of Nebraska, are aimed fundamentally or ostensibly at teaching young children how to read and write. So here is a book aimed at teaching children how to count. But the images that they use are images of war in the hopes of desensitizing them to violence, here using literally bombs and bullets and guns to teach young children. In addition to teaching them how to count, they also taught them to read using phrases like, "My uncle uses this gun to carry out a jihad against the Soviets. My uncle uses this sword to decapitate the Soviets." Now imagine the consequences of that. Imagine the effect that this would have on young children in refugee camps in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, displaced by the experience of war, trained in the ABCs using guns, bullets, and bombs, trained to read and write with repeated phrases of violence. What effect might that have? I should note here that I've given this speech several times, and one time I was actually giving it here at UCR, at the Middle Eastern Student Center, a couple years back. This was back before the pandemic, and it was in person. And at the end of the talk, a woman in the back raised her hand, and she stood up, and she identified herself as a teacher at one of these refugee camps, testifying that she had seen these textbooks firsthand and had seen the consequence and effect of these textbooks, that the violence that it produced, the desensitization towards the violence that it produced. So her and her fellow teachers resolved that they would address these textbooks by taking stickers of flowers and covering up the images of the bombs, the bullets, and the guns, covering up the phrases that encourage and exhort these young children to go and kill Soviet soldiers, using stickers of flowers in order to erase, in many ways, cover up the imperial violence that was being placed upon these young children. It was a really striking moment to hear this woman testify about the effects of these. If we talked about the endemic corruption of the 50s shaping the structure, so too do these textbooks shape the structure, or a haunting that produces eventually the Taliban. For you see, the Taliban are the refugees that were displaced by the war. This is the second generation. Some of the elders were anti-Soviet insurgents who then drew upon the young children who grew up in these madrasas and refugee camps in southern Afghanistan, in Pakistan, who were shaped by this experience of imperial meddling between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, who were shaped by the experience of displacement, the experience of refugee camps, and who were then radicalized by a fusion of a revivalist Islamist movement, the Deobandi, with American militarism. You have this Deobandi movement, this revivalist movement that imagines an attempt to create a pure Islamic nation state. But that is combined with the militarism that we see in these textbooks of young children who are growing up and learning the language of carrying out jihad in order to fight for their country. In other words, American militarism, the very thing that was lacking in the language of the intelligence report during the Soviet invasion. Afghans were willing to set aside their weapons. Afghans were willing to negotiate. Afghans were willing to listen to their village elders. Afghans were willing to work and operate on their own time. A rejection of that older way of thinking, and instead fusing the Deobandi ideology of these madrasas with the American militarism of these textbooks. That is what produces the Taliban. They are the second generation that is shaped by that particular moment. When the Soviet Union withdraws and the United States decides to withdraw its support, the result is the chaos of the 90s, an imperially produced chaos of the 90s, a corrupt government that is unable to support itself, that fails to meet the needs of ordinary people, and a second generation shaped and radicalized by this experience. They sweep into Afghanistan, exploiting that chaos, exploiting that violence, promising ordinary Afghans law and order. We will come into this area. We will overthrow the very warlords that have been come to capture Afghanistan in this moment of imperial chaos. We will fight against the US interests. We will fight against the interests of the warlords, and we will establish some semblance of order. Some semblance. Now, this sounds familiar. It's the very same language that they used in the 2000s. As they've swept back into Afghanistan, they've used the exact same language, that we are the antidote to the corruption, that we will establish law and order. In actuality, the Taliban are not some anti-imperial force, but a product of imperialism. Quite early on, they actually attempt to ally themselves with the United States. In the 90s, the United States will try to reach out through economic diplomacy into global capitalism in order to bring the Taliban into the fold. The State Department sees the Taliban as a potential ally who can perhaps bring some semblance of stability to Afghanistan. Why? Because if there's stability in Afghanistan, then you can build the gas and oil pipeline, a pipeline that was proposed by Unicol that would sweep through Afghanistan and bring wealth both to the Taliban and to Unicol and the United States. The United States seems to be quite favorable to the Taliban early on. In fact, Unicol invites the Taliban to Texas on a charm tour in order to kind of sway them, in order to become economic partners with the United States. So contrary to their language of anti-imperialism, they've always been willing to work with international powers like the United States and willing to participate in global capitalism. The relationship doesn't sour until the Taliban refuses to hand over Osama bin Laden, resulting in the bombing campaign of the late 90s. This sours the relationship between them and sets the stage for the horrible events of 9/11. 9/11 happens, and the United States once more turns its eyes to Afghanistan. It invades Afghanistan despite the fact that the Taliban offered to turn Osama bin Laden over very early in the war. By October and November of 2001, the Taliban are willing to hand over Osama bin Laden, but the Bush administration has no interest. And so what does the 20 years of US invasion and occupation produce? We see the hauntings of that older history shape the past 20 years. First, we find out that the very same corruption that shaped the 50s and then produced the chaos of the revolution is what the United States participates in the past 20 years. The Afghanistan Papers published quite massive expose of the economic situation in Afghanistan. For the past 20 years, the US has been fostering a corrupt system, propping up an unpopular regime while flooding the country with billions of dollars, estimates of upwards of $1 trillion. Now, ordinary Afghans aren't seeing this. Schools aren't seeing this. Economic progress isn't seeing this. Instead, who is seeing it? The few elites. And we have here from the Afghanistan Papers, by allowing corruption to fester, U.S. officials told interviews, in other words, they admitted, they helped destroy the popular legitimacy of the wobbly Afghan government they were fighting to prop up. With judges and police chiefs and bureaucrats extorting bribes, many Afghans soured on the democracy and turned to the Taliban to enforce order. Does this sound familiar? Yes, it's the history of the 50s haunting the 2000s once more. A system of endemic corruption, an economic situation that only benefits a few elites, and ordinary Afghans are left out. What is the result? An unpopular government, a government that is propped up by foreign aid, a government that is propped up by billions and billions of dollars of imperial and foreign interests, while ordinary Afghans are left to suffer the economic consequences. Our biggest mistake, our biggest single project, sadly, and inadvertently, of course, may have been the development of mass corruption, endemic corruption, built into the very structure of Afghanistan. While the United States spent 20 years shaping the economic situation, the very situation that the Taliban would orient itself as opposing, it will sweep into Afghanistan, claiming to be an antidote to this very corruption. We even have language of how some government officials fled Afghanistan in the last moments, taking billions of dollars with them or millions of dollars with them. At the same time, it also introduced a regime of deep brutality. Drone strikes in Afghanistan, this is from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, indicates that somewhere upwards of 13,000 drones have been dropped in Afghanistan. Now, I should note here that this is only based off of when the records start. So we don't have the full picture here. We don't. Anyone who does any type of work on drone warfare knows that it's ridiculously difficult to get any sort of information or data about what was going on during this time period. There was no transparency whatsoever. So this is a conservative estimate. There are whole years that we have no data about. This is basically just 2015 to 2020 that we have upwards of 13,000 drones dropped in Afghanistan, a brutal regime that turns the blue skies of Afghanistan into the experience of death for ordinary Afghans. So while you have a system of endemic corruption in Kabul where a few elites are benefiting, the United States is waging a brutal neo-colonial war of drone bombing in the rural countryside. And it is important to note that based off of whistleblower accounts, upwards of 90% of the people killed in drone strikes were not even the targets. From children in rural villages to weddings, this is the consequence of 20 years of war. Let's not forget that even in the sort of last moments of the disastrous U.S. withdrawal, the United States dropped one final drone in Kabul, which it claimed to have been targeting ISIS, but only after the investigative journalist accounts dug deeper did they finally admit that there was quote unquote a mistake, when in actuality, they end up killing an innocent Afghan family, 10 people, upwards of 7 children, and even more. Just an ordinary Afghan family who, ironically enough, seemed to have been initially an ally of the United States and worked as a translator or worked in USA aid. This is the consequence. This is the legacy of U.S. involvement over the past 20 years. Endemic economic corruption in the capital city and brutal imperial violence in the rural areas. So the question isn't how did the Taliban sweep into power, but is it any surprise that they swept back into power? The Taliban exploited this very system set up by the United States, just as it did in the 90s. This is how that history continues to haunt Afghanistan even to this day. The Taliban sweep back in. They say that they are here to counteract the violence of the drone warfare, to counteract the violence of the United States, and to address the corruption of Kabul. They go to region where the United States has cut deals with drug lords and warlords and various human traffickers. And what did the Taliban do? They used the very same system that the United States had set up. They offer bribes. The same thing that the United States offer to these various people, the Taliban does the exact same thing. They go to local areas, they say, hey, we can fight you, or we can give you millions of dollars, and you set aside your weapons and join us. These people who've grown fat off of American dollars now were willing to take the Taliban's money. In other words, the Taliban's return, the very structures that allowed them to sweep into power were set over the past 20 years by the United States itself. Now, of course, the irony here is the Taliban themselves are now using the very same language of the war on terror. We see that they carried out just yesterday a violent raid in one of the districts of Kabul. And the language that they used, that they were fighting Daesh. So here we see the global war on terror replicated by the Taliban themselves. Why? Because they are a product of that same imperial interest. The other thing that we see is those same textbooks that haunted the United States, that shaped and radicalized the Taliban in those displaced camps, in those refugee camps, those same textbooks fused with Deobandi ideology that formed the core of the Taliban movement are now being used by both ISIS and the Taliban themselves. Here we have images of these various schools where young Afghan children, in these rural areas in southern Afghanistan and in Pakistan are radicalized into the ideology of Daesh and into the ideology of the Taliban. And how do they do it? They use the exact same textbooks that were funded and written by the United States. I've seen them. The only thing that they've done is they've crossed out where it says, my uncle uses this sword to decapitate the Russians. They've crossed out where it says Russian, and they've written American. This is how that history continues to shape this particular moment. It's how the past haunts the present. And this is where I want to end it here, with a plea over who will remember this history of Afghanistan. During the withdrawal in the past 2 years, we have seen a desperate attempt to rewrite the history of the Afghan war, either by rewriting Afghanistan as inherently ungovernable, erasing its more pluralistic and diverse pre-modern history, or by writing the invasion of Afghanistan as the quote-unquote good war, as the war that was productive, but we were unable to be successful because Afghans chose not to fight. We see a rewriting of this happen. This is why talks like this, the symposium that Omar and Ali and the Middle Eastern Student Association at Study Center at UCR, why this symposium is so important, because it pushes back on those narratives. It pushes back on who gets to remember and write the history of those past 20 years. That history is filled with visible and invisible markers of colonialism, from the Afghanistan papers to the drone warfare. Even Biden's withdrawal holds many of the same markers that we see from the Soviet withdrawal. An alliance between two belligerent powers, in the case of the 80s, between the Soviet Union and the United States, here in the case with the United States and the Taliban, completely cutting out civil society and activists. We can see that history, those older markers still shaping it. But also that there is a tension between memory and history. How do we remember Afghanistan? Will what happened in the 2000s continue to happen afterwards? Will people remember Afghanistan when a tragedy strikes, but then forget it every other day? Will Afghanistan just become another country that, oh, there's chaos in Afghanistan? Will we remember the imperial interests there? Will we remember the endemic global capitalist corruption that was produced there? In other words, who will remember the Afghans? The tension between memory, how we remember Afghanistan, and the history of Afghanistan is crucial here. History is a challenge to the public memory, how the public will remember this particular moment. And I think this whole talk, in many ways, for me, is me urging everyone who is listening to remember the human cost of the past 20 years of war, the decade before that in the imperial imposed chaos that produced the Taliban, and the decades before that with the Cold War. To remember the human cost of imperial meddling and international involvement in Afghanistan, to remember the complexities and nuances of that history, and to reject reductive and overly simplistic narratives. With that, I thank you all for your wonderful attention and appreciate your apt attention to this talk. Hopefully it was interesting to all of you, and I think we have time for some questions. I don't know if Omar or Ali is going to guide us in regards to that, but thank you, each one of you, for attending and for coming out to History Talk on a Monday afternoon. So it looks like Ali's saying there are some questions that'll pop up on the screen. Mr. Saint asks, what is the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban? The relationship is complicated, and it's been complicated since the 90s. The Taliban are mostly a nationalist movement. They're interested in establishing the Islamic Emirate in Afghanistan. They don't seem to have transnationalist goals, or at least they didn't. They seem to be a little bit more open to transnationalist goals now, but they have had a friendly relationship with Al-Qaeda. So it's a sort of love-hate relationship in which Al-Qaeda has different aims and goals than the Taliban do, and at times those aims clash with one another. In fact, we know in the 90s that Mullah Omar very openly rebuked Osama bin Laden to say, please stop carrying out these attacks from Afghanistan's soil. It clashes with what our actual goals are. That said, they do often align So it is a complicated, nuanced relationship. They're not the same organization. They do have two separate goals, but those goals sometimes align with one another. And it is important to recognize that relationship. Thank you for your question, Mr. Saint. Let's see if we have other questions here. Hi, Omar.
Hey, Ali. Thank you again for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
The importance again, like you shared, of how will we remember Afghanistan, and making sure that we make this connection to the history. And I think it's so fascinating how you talk about so many things, so many patterns and things repeating itself, but just manifesting it into something that looks slightly different. So we want to thank those that have joined and that are asking questions through YouTube. Keep them coming. We will do our best to address them and get to all of them as quickly as possible. Once again, follow us on Twitter or Instagram for more information, and please use our hashtags, which is UCRAFG or hashtag AFG Symposium that are right there behind me if you're going to tweet or comment. So let's go to the question from Anish. So it says, thank you for, he says, or they say, thank you for engaging for the engaging presentation. Would you mind discussing how the CIA was able to implement the system of education through textbooks with violent themes to such a vast degree?
That's a fantastic question, Anish. And this is where you have to be able to place it within some type of context. These textbooks were introduced in the experience of displacement. So they're in refugee camps, in the madrasas of southern Afghanistan and in Pakistan. What ends up happening is that as a result of the US and the Soviet Union's involvement in Afghanistan, Afghan civil society completely collapsed. There is no education system in the 90s. There is no education system at all. And so the only thing that exists are these madrasas that have these textbooks. And so it's a generational issue, a generational experience in which you have a whole generation growing up and shaped by these textbooks. It's important to recognize that it is not an easy transition, that the older generation who remembers an older understanding of warfare and cultural experiences do not participate in these type of conflicts. And we find, for example, I always point out that there is not a single case of suicide bombing or that type of warfare in the Afghan-Soviet war. That it is really a whole other generation that has to be trained by these textbooks. And not just these textbooks, it's a fusion of American militarism from these textbooks with the Islamist revivalist movement of Deobandi, which is really taking root in southern Afghanistan and in the madrasas of Pakistan. So it's the fusion of the two, combined with the fact that there is no other form of education that exists. The Taliban in many ways are able to establish themselves as the only educational force in much of the country. Thank you for that question, Anish. That was a great question.
So the next question is from Fatih Salahuddin. Dr. Olomi, you mentioned the willingness to negotiate peace was different during the war with the Soviets than it is now. Is this unique to the Taliban, or is this now a larger cultural shift?
Yeah, so one of the things that we see is that the older generation of the Mujahideen were willing to negotiate, that they fought quite fiercely, but whenever the tribal elders called upon them to negotiate, they were willing to negotiate. The Taliban are willing to exploit that system. They will reach out to tribal elders and village elders in order to try to enact some form of peace that benefits them. But they're fighting, their style of warfare is far more violent than people in the sort of previous experience of war. Again, suicide bombing is not a natural experience in Afghanistan. It's an imported tactic that then gets used in the 2000s. Same thing with the targeting of civilians, right? The bombing of schools, the bombing of hospitals. These are imported tactics that we see from groups like the Haqqani group or the Haqqani network and the Taliban. So there's a cultural shift that happens as a result of a generational shift. The new generation is shaped by an entirely different experience of global warfare, whether that is the warfare of the 90s or the drone warfare of the 2000s. Thank you for your question, Fateh. I hope that answered it.
We had a question that came in anonymously, asking a little bit about Maoists and sort of their role during the Soviet occupation. And And I also want to sort of expand that a little bit further
Mhm.
onto the varying degrees of sort of political, like politics and involvement and political participation of Afghans. Because I think we kind of, for
Mhm.
those of us who know a little bit about Afghanistan, kind of understand there was like a monarchy, and then there was
Mhm.
kind of the Soviet occupation, but not necessarily thinking about all the different the different groups that were also part of what made Afghanistan part of the sort of political engagement within Afghanistan. So could you talk a little bit more about that, like sort of the diversity within the
Yeah.
country where people were?
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic question. And diversity is the key word here. That Afghanistan is not just a culturally, ethnically diverse country, it's also a politically diverse country. You had leftist movements, you had Maoist movements, Marxist movements, you had pro monarchy movements, pro democracy movements, all shaped the 50s, 60s, and 70s experience of Afghanistan. And this is also important for understanding the diversity within the Mujahideen themselves. The Mujahideen do not have a unified political ideology beyond just anti Soviet insurgency. They see themselves as opposing a deeply unpopular regime in Kabul and resisting the invasion of the Soviet Union. But on the whole, they don't have any political conformity. There's actually a great deal of diversity in them. The Mujahideen includes Maoists. In fact, some of the communist parties that will emerge in the 90s will be originally Mujahideen fighters. They were Mujahideen who fought alongside the other different factions against the Soviet Union, and in the 90s will become the Communist Party of Afghanistan. It's slightly defunct now, but it was one of the factions that will emerge as an attempt to say, okay, hold on, let's create a coalition, let's push back on these kind of bigger groups. The more organized elements of the Mujahideen, however, were aligned with some sort of Islamist ideology. We see that with the Islami Jamiat Islami, for example, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, one of the more retrograde reactionary elements within the Mujahideen, but also more pro-democracy and movements led by various factions. So the Mujahideen themselves don't have political conformity, and this is a reflection of the political diversity of the 50s, 60s, and 70s that include monarchist factions, that include reformist democratic factions, that include Republican factions, leftists, Maoists, Marxists, Leninists. So it is a politically diverse culture. It's a politically diverse scene. And that's often forgotten when we talk about Afghanistan. It often gets flattened into Marxists on one side and Islamists on the other, when in actuality, it's far more complicated than that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you talked a little bit about how it is right. It's complicated, and there's so many different groups. And is there something unique? What is it about Afghanistan's history that you think that makes it? A lot of people say it's really governance is challenging in Afghanistan. That's like a rhetoric that a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
say. What's kind of the truth to that, or what would you say? How would you respond to people who say, oh, they've never had some sort of like system of governance or
Yeah,
of peace and stability.
right.
But what does Afghanistan's history tell you in response to that?
That's an Orientalist bullshit, is what it tells me. Because this language of Afghanistan being inherently ungovernable belies the actual history. Afghanistan has been governed for centuries, from its very inception before the rise of nation states, as part of multiple different empires. It was literally part of these vast imperial territories that were governable then, that was governable in the early 20th century as well, the rise of the nation state. We see whole decades in which Afghanistan has stability and has peace. The problem is that Afghanistan is what I call a semi-colonized country. That is, from its very inception as a nation state, it emerges caught between much larger imperial powers. Initially, during the Great Game of the United Kingdom and the Russian Empire, Afghanistan, very early on, we have even one of their emirs almost replicate to this word for word the language of Daoud Khan, who says, I'd like to burn my American cigarette with a Russian match. Early on, one of the emirs says that I feel like a swan in a lake, and there's a bear on one side and a tiger on the other, referring to Great Britain and the empire, the Russian Empire. And so Afghanistan has always been caught between these imperial forces that have imposed chaos onto the country, that have caused and exacerbated its issues. In actuality, for much larger spans of time, Afghanistan were stable. Afghanistan had elements of peace, as much as any other country does. All nation states are bloody. All nation states are born from ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so that we have to recognize that particular component of Afghan history. For example, the violence and oppression of the Hazara people at the beginning stages of the development of the nation state of Afghanistan. And yet the idea that somehow Afghanistan is uniquely ungovernable is simply not true. While it is true that sometimes centralized governments have a difficult time projecting their military might as a result of the geography of Afghanistan, when you look at the actual history, we're looking at centuries of stability, centuries of governance. We're looking at decades in the recent era of governance, which all push back on this kind of Orientalist language. The language of Afghanistan being ungovernable is a tactic in order to wipe away the complicity of international forces in the instability of Afghanistan.
Thank you again for sharing that. I asked that because I feel like I hear that rhetoric a lot, and so I thought it was just important to mention that as well.
Yeah.
I'll kind of end on this last question of what are maybe one or two things that you think that people should know or recognize about Afghanistan's history, or maybe one or two things that you think people get wrong and that needs to be corrected. Besides watching this entire discussion, and today's presentation, are there one or two things you think that you want people to always remember when they're thinking about the history of Afghanistan and how it relates to today's conflict?
Yes, absolutely. The first and foremost of it is that Afghanistan's history is more complicated than you were led to believe, that the contemporary situation has its roots decades earlier. And it is important for us to think of history as a lens of analysis, of understanding the contemporary moment by looking at the historical context. That not to look at this particular moment and go, oh, okay, the Taliban are back because Afghans are inherently Islamists and they are inclined towards reactionary governments, that they don't want democracy. No. To instead look at this contemporary moment and then ask questions about the 20 years of US occupation and war, to ask questions about the decade of civil war in the 90s, to ask about the Soviet invasion and the US involvement decades before that, to ask about the historical context, to think of Afghanistan's history as more complicated than the reductive ways that we think about it in our public memory. The other thing that I want people to walk away from this is to understand that Afghanistan's history does not end today. The drone wars will continue. Afghanistan will continue to be droned, and American interests and international interests will continue to play a role in Afghanistan. The question is, will we remember Afghanistan? Will we remember the 20 years of war and the decades that led up to it? Will we remember that war, or will Afghanistan fade from public memory and only prop up when some form of tragedy strikes? History does not end today. It continues. So those are the two things I would hope that everyone walks away understanding about Afghanistan. And of course, please be sure to tune in to the rest of the symposiums put on this week.
And thank you. And I wanted to also see if there was anything you wanted to, where can people find you? Where can they find more information about your work? What are some places people can go to learn more?
I mean, you can all check me out on Twitter, AAOLOMI. I always hate telling people about Twitter. Every time someone's like, hey, I follow you from Twitter, my initial response is, I'm so sorry. I spend a bit too much time shit posting on Twitter, but
yeah,
I also
right now Twitter is the only thing we have because apparently the internet is shut down. I guess.
I saw Instagram and Facebook has collapsed on us. As my friends would point out, Mercury's in retrograde, or Mercury is in rigatone, as a friend of mine said. But yeah, check me out on Twitter. And in between my shit posts, I do put out some serious scholarship and threads and whatnot on Twitter, and that's AAOLOMI.
Thank you, Dr. Olomi. We're so grateful to have you today. And I wanted to leave on a couple of notes. Number one, we are going to be continuing this conversation tonight, we will have a panel with Dr. Maria Hanoun and Dr. Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. And Dr. Olomi will be coming back as well. So that'll be at 6 Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. So we're very excited for our panelists who are going to be speaking tonight. And we'll be continuing this conversation. It'll be a discussion with opportunity again to ask questions and learn more. The last thing I wanted to leave folks on is that the University of California, Riverside is actually working on a fundraiser similar to many other institutions and universities across California and across the nation to sponsor and bring 2 scholars to UCR. And so the University of California, Riverside is working alongside the Scholars at Risk program. So we will post the link on our YouTube, and you'll find it on social media. But we wanted to make you all aware that this is an opportunity to contribute and support folks from Afghanistan who want to continue their education and come to the U.S. and come and join us at UC Riverside. So please make sure you check that out and donate generously. We've been able to get a $100,000 matching donation. So we want to make sure we reach that target so that the university can match that. So we have up to $200,000 that we can raise and support these scholars who come to the U.S. and work with us at UC Riverside. So we want to make sure, follow us on Instagram and Twitter for all the latest updates. Once again, this was the first day of our week-long symposium, and we're excited to see you all return and join. And please make sure you're on Twitter and Instagram. Please share comment, feedback, whatever questions you might have that you want to ask the panelists at any point. Please make sure you go ahead and share that with us. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you all in a couple hours for our panel tonight. Have a good day, everybody.